Hello everybody. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how to diagnose and replace a front wheel bearing on my 2002 Acura TL Type S. Specifically, it is my front left or the front driver's side wheel bearing that has gone bad on my vehicle finally after 306,000 miles. That's a very long time for a wheel bearing to last. Some signs that I've personally experienced with a bad wheel bearing include a very loud humming noise as you pick up speed. The faster you go, the louder it gets. I've also felt a slight vibration in the accelerator pedal. Also, when I'm making very sharp right turns, I've heard a grinding noise. I'm guessing because that there's play in the wheel, which happens when you have a bad wheel bearing. I'm guessing that it's the rotor that's rubbing up against the rotor heat shield in the wheel. Speaking of playing the wheel, you can see my vehicle is jacked up. If you jack up the vehicle, you can test to see if there's any play in all directions. And lastly, when you're driving down the road, for example, since it's the driver's side, if you make a left turn, that's going to shift all the weight of the vehicle towards the passenger side and relieve some of that weight off the driver's side wheel. And when you do that, the noise will go away until you straighten out the vehicle or are making a right turn. So I will demonstrate all of the following in the next couple clips. You can also hear a grinding noise when making very sharp right turns, so we'll kind of try to demonstrate that now for you. See how the left turns goes away and comes back? That's definitely a sign of a bad bearing there for sure too. The last way you can test for a bad wheel bearing is to grab the wheel at every different angle and see if there is a consistent amount of play and noise. So I'll test that for you now. Good amount of noise there. Still there. Grab it on the side. Still more noise. Grab it from the bottom. You can hear that noise and feel it no matter where I grab the wheel. Just wanted to make a couple notes before we get started. I would give yourself 2 days to work on this since it's a lengthy process, and also in case you break something or need to buy a tool or part from the store. No, I did not need an alignment after replacing my wheel bearing since we removed the knuckle. Press the brake pedal a few times before driving since we removed the caliper. I would also recommend buying a wheel bearing press kit with a grade 8 drive bolt. That will ensure you can use an impact wrench and also that the threads will not strip. Also, check out the description for more information, including torque specs and links to items used in this video, and feel free to ask a question in the comments. Alright, so now we're just going to start off by buying some parts that we may or may not need. So we'll come to AcuraPartsForLess.com, select our vehicle, 2002 TL Sedan Type S. Come on down to chassis and front brake. And here is our wheel bearing. However, you can see it's $84, which is way too much. It is an NSK brand. They were nice enough to give us that at least. So we'll come to this online parts catalog, and it's called showmetheparts.com/NSK, and we'll be able to find our part number here. I don't think NSK will make a wheel bearing for every vehicle, but if they do make one for yours, I would highly recommend it because they're very high quality. We're just typing in our model, and here is our front wheel bearing. So we'll just copy that part number right there. And you can find it on Amazon for 38 bucks, the exact same wheel bearing. Mine lasted 306,000 miles on my car, so that's why I would highly recommend this brand. Next, we'll just come back to this website, Coming back down the chassis again, and here's the knuckle. Here's the upper control arm. Here's the nut and the cotter pin. Here's the knuckle. Here's the nut and the cotter pin for the lower control arm. Here is our wheel sensor in case that needs replacing. And then last but not least, come on down to chassis and power steering gearbox. And here is the tie rod as well in case something goes wrong with that. All right, I'm just gonna quickly go through some tools and parts that you are definitely gonna need, or at least I would highly recommend you getting. First would be a Dremel. That's gonna be used for cutting the inner race of the old wheel bearing so you can crack it and remove it from the old hub shaft. Then we've got wheel bearing press kit. You could also use a hydraulic press, or once you get the knuckle off, you could even take it to a shop and they'll do it for you. Of course, you'll be paying at that point then. And then here is some M8 by 1.25 bolts. Get the longest bolt you can. These will be used for getting the rotor off if you ever have difficulty getting the rotor off. Then we've got a massive 36 millimeter impact socket. That's going to be used for taking off the spindle nut off of the axle. And then this is just a 1 1/4 inch socket for the bolt in the wheel bearing press kit. Get a nice set of grippy needle nose pliers, preferably ones that still have the jagged teeth on there so you can get a good grip on the snap ring. That'll be holding in the old wheel bearing. An adjustable wrench and some big hammers. The bigger the better for pounding stuff out. I'd also recommend getting some new cotter pins, as these are pretty old, rusted, and I did break a couple of them. You can get them for under $1 at Home Depot. I'll post some links in the description. So whenever jacking up the vehicle, you always want to set your e-brake. And we're also just going to put some chucks under the wheels as well. Next, we can jack up the vehicle and place our jack stand. Next, we can remove the wheel. Next, what we have to do is we have to remove this spindle nut. And the first step in doing that is there's a little divot in the spindle nut that we have to press out, and I'm going to attempt to accomplish that with a screwdriver and a hammer. With enough hammering, I'd like to think I got it out pretty good. Kind of started by hammering at a downward angle, and then kind of hammered by pushing it straight in just to kind of separate it from the spindle itself, and same thing from the bottom, and eventually it'll work its way out. And so now we can remove the actual spindle itself. And for that, you're going to need your 36 millimeter socket. This is one heck of a beast. And you'll probably either need an impact wrench or a breaker bar, because that sucker is on there. It's torqued down to 181 foot-pounds. Let's try the impact wrench first. There we go, that actually wasn't too bad. Next, we have to remove these two brake hose mounting bolts, since we're gonna be removing the entire caliper assembly. And so we can just also spray them down with a little bit of WD-40. There we go. As with any old rusty bolt, I always highly recommend using a 6-sided hex socket. Otherwise, they came out just fine. And then for the next step, we're going to be removing the caliper bracket assembly, and that's held in by two 17 millimeter bolts. One up there and one towards the bottom, right down there. Before we remove those bolts though, we're going to have to just take a hold of the caliper itself and just kind of give it a good couple pulls. Just kind of towards you. Use your body weight. Give it a good couple pulls, and that'll kind of loosen up the caliper, so that way when you remove the bracket bolts, the whole brake caliper and bracket assembly will actually come off the rotor, since it's usually on there with such a tight tolerance. Then after removing the brake caliper assembly, you can just set it off to the side, and I just put it on a simple box. I think that's the easiest solution. Otherwise, a lot of people like to hang it by a wire or something from up there, but that's what I like to do. Next, we have to remove the brake rotor itself. And normally it's held in by 2 screws right there and there, but I do not like those screws as they have a very high tendency to rust. You can use what's called an impact driver. It's basically like a screwdriver that you'll put in there, and then you'll take your hammer and you'll smack this end of it, and when you smack it, it kind of turns it like a quarter of a turn, and it'll remove the screw that way. But since I never put those in, the whole rotor is already pretty much loose. But after you get those 2 screws out, if it's still stuck in there pretty good, there are these other 2 holes down here. And what you can do is you can go to Home Depot and you can get some M8 by 1.25 bolts and get the longest bolt you can find. The longest one I was able to find is 40 millimeter. You can put these bolts in there and you can tighten them in, and it'll push against the hub and it'll remove it that way. It's a super convenient design. I highly recommend it. These 2 bolts only cost like $1. I'll put them in the description. And so after that, you can remove the entire rotor. Next, we have to remove the ABS sensor. And so it's held in by a couple of brackets. So we got to remove a bolt there. And then we have to remove a bolt there. And then following it on down and back, there's the actual sensor itself, and we have to remove that little bolt right there. And after making one heck of a long attempt to try and get this ABS sensor out, I was unsuccessful and also didn't feel like breaking it because it's a $70 part. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna follow this line back up, and we're going to remove it through the firewall here. So we're just gonna remove the rest of this bracket out if we can. There's a little bolt right there. And then we're gonna make our way to the top of the vehicle, and we're gonna remove our airbox assembly. And to remove this air assembly piece, we have to remove this C-clamp. There's a 10 millimeter bolt right there that will loosen to loosen this ring. Then there's a tube here we have to disconnect. There's a little clamp here. We'll take simple pliers, you squeeze it, and you'll move it back a little bit, and you can pull this tube out. Be sure not to lose your little clamp. Then there's another tube right here we got to remove. I like using a little pick tool like this to kind of just get in there and pry it out. Then we have to remove these 2 bolts, which are 8 millimeters, and then this whole assembly should generally come right on out. And while we're at it, we can check our air filter. And so we'll come back under the car, and we're gonna take our needle nose pliers, and we're gonna take this uppermost little clip, we'll squeeze it, and we'll push it on through. And that'll remove this little clip right there. Next, we will take this little orange connector, we'll push down on the little button, and we'll wiggle the connector out. Then we will take our screwdriver, a flathead screwdriver. You can see there's a little tab like right in there. We're gonna use our screwdriver and we're gonna kind of push it in, and then there's another little tab on the other, kind of right in there, and then we'll be able to push the wire all the way through. And with that little clip kind of pushed through the firewall, we can take the rest of the wire and kind of guide it on through. There we go. And now we've got just this little bolt to disconnect. After taking care of the ABS wheel sensor, we are next going to remove the tie rod ball joint. So we have to remove this little cotter pin here. We can use needle nose pliers to kind of bend it straight and pull it on through. And then we'll remove the nut. And also, we're going to take some WD-40 and we're just going to give that a good spray too. Then we'll take our 17mm deep socket and we will remove the nut for the tie rod and ball joint, and it should come off pretty easily. Once that nut is loosened, what you can do is you can take a hammer, you can hit right here on the knuckle a couple times and it should come loose pretty easily. With the tie rod ball joint loose, we will then come down here to the lower control arm ball joint. Same thing, we'll remove this cotter pin and we will remove the castle nut. And we're also just going to give it a spray of WD-40. With that cotter pin removed, we can now take a 17mm deep socket and we can loosen this castle nut. Removing this lower control arm nut was by far the hardest part. So what I did, since I can't really get my big old hammer in there, I turned the whole wheel kind of outward like that. And I took a nice long piece of pipe and I pressed it up against the lower control arm, and then I smacked this other end with the hammer. That way I could get a lot more leverage, and eventually it broke free. And then we got the last of the 3 bolts. We got the upper control arm. Same thing, we got a cotter pin. We'll take that out, and then we gotta take the castle nut off. And the cotter pin is out, and we used a deep 17mm socket. And now we're going to try using that hammer again, and we're going to see if we can break it loose. And with enough tapping, I just kind of tapped on the side of the knuckle, and I made the nut flush with the bolt, and eventually a couple good whacks right here broke it loose. Also, another tip on the ball joints, these bolts will, after you break them loose, and if the nut is still on there, the bolt itself will start to spin. The best way to remove the nut afterwards is to put the bushing back in, apply a good amount of pressure upwards, which will prevent the bolt from spinning, and then loosen the nut like that. If you use an impact wrench while applying upward pressure or downward pressure for this one, that will remove the nut pretty easily in my experience. And to remove the axle, you can take a piece of wood like this and a hammer and simply tap it out. And you can work it the rest of the way out like that. So next we need to hammer out the hub. So here's my setup. I've got the knuckle on 2 jacks. And then I've got a 1 1/4 inch socket as well as a 30mm socket. I could go a little bit bigger, but that's the biggest I've got and it should suffice. And then we're just gonna take a hammer and pound it on out. There we go, that wasn't too bad. You just want to make sure you have a solid support under it so all of your energy from the hammer isn't being absorbed, such as using these jack stands. So that worked pretty good. With the hub out, next we have to remove the snap ring. I might recommend spraying it with a bunch of WD-40 since it's pretty rusty, and also take a little screwdriver or a pick or something like this and kind of tapping it around just to break it loose since it's in there pretty good. And I would highly recommend using nice needle nose pliers with really grippy teeth still at the end. And I'm gonna try squeezing it out. And if I can't get it out with just the pliers, I might also get a screwdriver and try and wedge it in there and pry that ring out. Okay, here we go. That's that. Finally. And with the snap ring out, before we remove the bearing, we're just gonna compare and see which direction it needs to go back in. So on the new bearing, you got a black surface or a black ring, and then on the other side, you got a silver metal ring. And so this is the outside of the vehicle. So we will put the metal side in towards the center of the vehicle with the black ring towards the outside of the vehicle. It's also at this time that you could remove this heat shield, but quite frankly, mine is so rusted that I'm not even gonna bother. We're going to remove the wheel bearing next, and we need to choose the appropriate equipment. So it starts off with this giant bolt and a single washer. Next, we're gonna need to choose the appropriate sized adapter that'll fit in the back side of the knuckle on the bearing. We want it to be large enough to cover a majority of the surface area, but not so much that it'll get stuck. And you can hear and feel that there's just a little bit of play in there, so that's the perfect size for that. Then we need to choose the appropriate sleeve. It obviously needs to be big enough for the bearing to fit inside. So we'll use that one, and it'll fit on the knuckle just like so. And then we need to choose the corresponding plate that fits over that. The bolt will stick through the backside, through there. We'll take another washer, and then we'll take our nut, tighten that down, and we'll use a wrench to hold this in place with one hand, and then we'll use another wrench to tighten this bolt down, and it'll force the bearing on through. And the nice thing about this kit is you can actually use an impact wrench on this bolt without wrecking it. And another important note is, before you do this, you want to dunk or at least cover this entire bolt with some engine oil for lubricant, since there's going to be a lot of torque applied. I've got a adjustable wrench on the bottom, and then I've got a 1 1/4 inch socket on top. So let's cross our fingers, and here we go. Ooh, that's on there pretty good. So the impact wrench didn't really work at breaking it loose, but at least it's on there so tight that I really shouldn't need a second wrench, and I can kind of use my body weight and stuff to hold the knuckle down, and I'll just kind of press down on my breaker bar here and go from there. Down there good. Oh yeah. Oh, that was it. I felt that crack you heard, that was it breaking loose, and now all of a sudden it's got much easier. Woo. And I guess we'll just keep doing that until it goes through into the sleeve. And after manually putting it through about 1 inch, I could probably finish it off with the impact wrench from there. And again, I just want to make note that make sure you put engine oil on the bolt, because even just moving it that 1 inch, you can feel this thing is pretty warm, getting warm. So anyways, let's see if we can finish it off. There we go. Bearing is out. All right. And the old bearing is officially out. Now we'll just take some Carb or brake parts cleaner, and we'll just clean out this inner ring of the knuckle. It's pretty dirty. So now we have to choose the hardware for putting the bearing back in. So we're looking at the inside of the knuckle right now. So the bearing will be pressed in towards us from this current perspective. So I'll start with this bolt going in and the washer, and we have to choose an adapter which will fit on the inside of the knuckle here. This is brown outer metal ring part. You want to get the largest one you can. There's a little bit of gap, but this is the largest one that comes with the kit, and it should suffice, so that'll be fine. We got the knuckle flipped over, so we got the outside facing us now. And again, we've got our bolt with the appropriate adapter, flat surface facing towards the outside of the vehicle up. And then it'll stick up through the knuckle, and then through our new bearing. And now, remember again, we want this black ring to face the outside of the vehicle. And then we'll select our new adapter. We want this little lip to go inside the new bearing, and the new diameter of this adapter should be just under the diameter of the new bearing. And so that'll go on top like that. We'll grab our washer, put it there, and then the nut will go on top like that. Don't forget to dunk that bolt in some engine oil again. All right, got everything set up, and we'll just start it by hand. Just to get things tightened down. And then we'll move it over to those wood boards again. Sure it's going in straight. Yep, looks like it still is. If I can get my footing right. There we go. And I didn't start off with an impact wrench because I wanted to ensure that it was going to go in straight, not crooked, and cause any dings or imperfections on the face of the knuckles. So I highly recommend starting it by hand like I did. So we're getting to the end, and there's a lip at the bottom of the knuckle so that the bearing doesn't go all the way through, and you should be able to feel that. So let's keep going here. Haven't felt any obvious resistance from hitting that bottom of the knuckle yet. Oh, and there it is. Yep, stop right there. It was very obvious when you hit the bottom of the knuckle. And so now our new bearing is in. And there you have it. Brand new wheel bearing is in with the black ring facing the outside of the vehicle. Then we can put this lovely snap ring back in. Much easier going back in than taking it out. First try, actually. All right. And next, we have to remove the inner race of the old wheel bearing off of the hub. And so we have to do that by cutting a little divot in with a Dremel, and then we can use a chisel and we can crack it off, and then it should pull right off. So I shall try and demonstrate that for you now. With our little Dremel cut deep enough throughout it, we can put it face flat down like that, put the chisel end at the very top, and we can give it a good little whack. And just give it a good whack. There we go. It should be free now. I think you can see. It's moving. See how it's starting to separate a little bit? And there we have it. And again, we'll just clean off the surface with a little bit of Carb or brake cleaner. And now we need to choose the equipment for putting the hub back in the new bearing. So we've got our bolt and a washer. Then we need to select an attachment that'll cover this inner race. And that one looks pretty good there. And this is the back of the knuckle that we're looking at. And so the bolt will go down through there. Then with the bolt now sticking up through the front of the knuckle, our hub will sit in there like that. And then we need to select an attachment that'll fit over this ring. So we got this kind of semi-hollowed out piece there. And that fits perfectly right over that. And again, we'll take a second washer and then the nut will go on top like that. We got the bolt oiled up, everything in place. And now we can start tightening it by hand again, making sure that it goes in evenly. Felt a little bit of a click there, which must have been it kind of straightening out. Looks pretty good though. Feels smooth. All right, and I think I'll just get it going with the impact wrench since it's already started and pretty straight. All right, I'd say that's good enough there. You can see it kind of suddenly stopped, and so I'm going no further. And there we have it. No more noise. Next, we're gonna put the knuckle back on, as well as get the axle back in the center of the hub. So here we go. Just gotta get the little ball bearings started. Go. With the knuckle on the bottom control arm, I can now work the axle through the hub. So I'm just going to try and move that back in. It slides right in pretty easily. Okay, now I can put the upper control arm in place. And then also just kind of get the other tie rod in place as well, just a little bit. And there we go. We got the knuckle successfully back on the vehicle. And so now we can work towards basically doing everything in a reverse order process. So we're gonna start by hand tightening all the castle nuts on the upper control arm, the lower control arm, and the tie rod, and then we'll start torquing them down. So we've gotten it kind of tightened down by hand, and so now what we're gonna do is we're gonna torque it down to 29 foot-pounds. Okay, that's 29 foot-pounds. And what we need to do is we need to keep tightening it until we can get a cotter pin through that hole. You never wanna loosen it, and you also don't wanna torque it over 35 foot-pounds either. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna keep torquing it down 1 pound at a time until the castle nut is lined up perfectly for us to get our cotter pin in there. So we'll just increment one at a time. So I'll do 30 all the way up until 35. And that looks pretty lined up to me, so I could get my cotter pin in there. Cotter pin in place. Now we can go on to the lower control arm down here. So when applying this bottom bolt to the lower control arm, when trying to tighten the nut, the bolt also tends to spin. So what I did was I applied downward pressure to the knuckle itself, and then I used my impact wrench to tighten it on. I don't want to impact it on too tight because it's only supposed to go down to 35 foot-pounds, so I just used that to help assist in getting it, tightened up the bolt, and now we can go by hand. Same thing with the upper control arm. We can now tighten this one down to its initial torque spec, which is 36 foot-pounds, and it goes all the way up to 43 foot-pounds. So we'll start with the 36. All right, there's 36. Let's take a look, and that's actually spot on. I can feed my cotter pin right in through there, so I don't need to torque it down anymore. There we go. The cotter pin is in place on the lower control arm. Now we're gonna work on the tie rod here, so we'll just get that in place, and we'll tighten down the bolt. For the tie rod, I was able to maintain pressure by using a large pliers like this and squeeze the tie rod into the knuckle while tightening down the nut so the bolt wouldn't spin. And now for this one, we can just simply torque it down to 32 foot-pounds. There's no variability or additional tightening needed. Just torque it down to 32 foot-pounds, and then we can place the cotter pin in. Cotter pin is in place, and now we can apply our spindle nut. So before we do that, we just need to apply a dab of engine oil to this seating surface, and then we're going to torque down our spindle nut to about 181 foot-pounds. I was only able to torque it down to 120 foot-pounds since that's the most my torque wrench will allow me to go to, and the original mark was already just a hair past it, so I figured I would just give it a little extra torque with the impact wrench. And so now we'll just put the little divot in the axle, and the spindle nut should be all taken care of. That ought to do it. That spindle nut ain't going nowhere. And so before things get too cluttered with the brake caliper and whatnot and the rotor, we're gonna guide our wheel sensor back up in through the firewall, way up there. We just got to tighten down the wheel sensor bracket nuts when they're there and there. Just got to snug them by hand. You forget which nuts go where. The longer nuts are for the brake line. There's 2 of them, and then the shorter nuts are for the wheel sensor. And then we'll just guide the rest of the wire up on in there. At the very bottom of that hole, you'll see there's a little notch there, and you have to match up the corresponding divot to it as you place it in. There we go. Then we can put our little orange connector back on. And then we can press in this last little white clip into that hole down there. Then we can put our air filter back in place, and we can take our air filter assembly and we can put it on top. Here's just a quick view of what it should look like when it's all put back together. Here's the 2 air filter bolts. Here's this tube. There's this tube with the little clamp on top. Then here's our little O-ring tightened down as well. All right, so now we can put the brake rotor back on. And so we have to align it properly. You'll notice there are these 2 screw holes right there and there. They are located to the right of the lugs. And then looking down on the rotor again, here are the chamfered screw holes located to the right of the lugs. These are the ones that you'll line up, not these. These will go kind of to the sides. You can see the little imprints on the hub from when removing the rotor. Now we can take our brake caliper assembly and we can place it over the rotor, and then we can line up these 2 holes and hand tighten the 2 bolts from the back. Both of the brake caliper bolts can be torqued down to 80 foot-pounds. After the caliper's in, don't forget to put your little brake line bracket back in place. And very last but not least, you can put your wheel back on and you can torque it down to 80 foot-pounds. And something else I like to do additionally, especially after messing with the brakes and stuff, I like to take the car for a short drive, a mile or 2 down the road, come back, and then I'll torque the wheels down to 80 foot-pounds again, just because sometimes it can not seat 100% properly, just because we took the rotor off and everything. So I like to torque it down twice. Also, earlier in the video, you may have remembered that we had tugged on the caliper to kind of loosen up the brake pad so we could remove the entire caliper off the wheel. So before you actually do go for that drive, make sure you push on the brake pedal before you put the car into gear and take off. And that wraps up my video on how to replace a front wheel bearing. I just want to say thanks for watching. I hope this video could be insightful and provide you with a bunch of good information on working on your wheel bearing. Check out the description. I'll be placing a bunch of information including torque specs and links to parts used in this video. Also feel free to ask a question or leave a comment. I'm pretty good at getting back to people as well. So again, thanks for watching and take care.